I'm looking at the future, some future directions for peace and conflict research. We heard yesterday from Chris Mitchell, who was talking about the last 30, 40 years of peace research. I've been involved with the peace research community since about the 80s, when I first got involved at the University of London, creating a Centre for Peace Studies. And I was on the council of the Conflict Research Society at the time.
I was with you. We
Yes.
met Saturday for
That's right.
13 times.
We did.
13 Saturdays.
We met.
We worked for 3 or 4 hours.
Yeah. No, we did some good work. And Cedric Smith was the chair. And I also got involved with the International Peace Research Association, which we've just had the 50th anniversary of in Istanbul, which was very moving. And again, I met quite a lot of the key players in that way back. For my own doctoral research, I was also enrolled at the University of London, as well as working for the university to create a Centre for Peace Research. I was doing my own doctoral research, which, as all these things do, they take different forms, but it ended up being an intellectual history of the search for peace from 1945 to, in the end, 2001, which was my cut-off period. And I looked at different knowledge fields. So I looked at the history of philosophy, the history of psychology, and the history of religious studies and theology, and historiography as well. And I asked what thinkers in these fields have been talking about peace, what have they been doing during this time, and what organisations have been working. The CRS is just one of a huge archipelago like IPRA and other groups. I had chapters on the history of the natural sciences, history of economic thinking, history of political science, and so on. Which were put in the appendices because, you have a word limit for a doctorate. But anyway, out of that research, there was also a praxis which I was involved with, which was creating a multi-faith mediation service. In the 90s, I was Secretary General of the World Conference on Religion and Peace in the UK and Ireland, and worked a lot with interfaith dispute resolution. So, and I attended a meeting in Rome with 900 religious leaders under the former Pope, and some of the greatest theologians on the planet were there. They were discussing what can we do about peacemaking in the Balkans and in the Middle East and so on. And I chaired a session for them, and with people who were, some of them had been involved with the founding of the United Nations. There was a Jewish peace activist who'd managed to lobby to get the word "we the peoples" in the founding charter of the UN. Originally, they'd wanted to put the words "we the governments." So anyway, a lot of this networking resulted in the formation of an Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy, which is now in a castle in Scotland. And it's an ongoing research centre, and we have students and scholars come from all over the world. And I'm still coordinator of Philosophers of Peace in Europe. I used to do that job globally, so I've networked and talked to philosophers all over the planet about this. And where I'm coming from is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from Steve, whose work I respect immensely. Instead of asking, what are the terrible things, the terrifying things that the system is doing to us, and how can we combat that, based on ignorance, fear, and surveillance is all about fear of terrorism and so on. What I'm asking is, where is the wisdom that we can draw on to dispel this negativity and this fear? I've coined a word which I call joyism, which is the antidote to terrorism. I'm a linguist. I've done a dictionary of philosophical terminology in all different languages, from Sanskrit to ancient Greek to Latin to Basque. And I've looked at the sort of terminology, because all we have, the only weapons peace scholars have and peace philosophers have is language. And we have to reframe our conflicts and our fears in new ways. So I've coined this word joyism to make the concept of terrorism outmoded, in the next 100 years. Okay, so what I'm going to do is run through a series. There's about 20 proposals, concrete, specific research projects that either my institute's already involved with or networks of people I'm involved with. And really, it's offering this ongoing research to the CRS and to colleagues, and saying, I think this is important. This is why we're doing it. If you're involved with a research institute and would like to help get involved, this is too big for one centre to do. And I think this is stuff the planet should be doing, and it should be focusing minds. when Linus Pauling wrote the wonderful book No More War in 1958, he called for the creation of a World Peace Research Organization with like 5,000 staff and a budget of $100 million. That was in 1958. The forward book was by Einstein. And we still don't have it. You know, if we had it, this would be some of the things I'd suggest we need. And I'll explain the rationale behind this as I go through them. Okay, so the first thing is just to explain something about my own research interest, where I'm coming from. And I call this transpersonal peace research theory. This was the fruit of my doctoral studies, but it's bigger than anyone's sort of scholarship. In my interest in linking transpersonal psychology with historical sciences, I've come to the conclusion that what Western scientific scholars are not very good at, and historians included, is looking at the transpersonal or noetic aspects of human nature. We've studied conflict from a material perspective, from a resource conflict dimension, and most people realise it's about identity, identity conflicts. But what I think is lacking is a realisation that people ultimately have a sense of spiritual identity. At core, we have a kind of existential sense of self with a narrative, with a story, and with a meaning. Many people find that in religious systems, but nowadays people, many people describe themselves as spiritual rather than religious. Probably about 80% of people on the planet. Well, what do they mean by that? And what do we do when people's definitions of what it is to be spiritual come into conflict? That's what I've been looking at, and that's what I think we need a transpersonal peace theory for, is how can we reconcile these metaphysical identities that people inhabit. And I've studied at great length a comparative map of all the different spiritual and religious epistemologies out there. I've produced a periodic table of the world's religious and philosophical traditions, because I worked for 10 years as head of religious studies in the school sector in the UK, teaching kids from 12 to 18 about religious studies. And to make sense of it, I produced like a periodic table, which is on the web, and you can access. And there's 164 possible, like Mendeleev's table of the periodic elements. So what I'm calling for is a much more sophisticated study of comparative religions and spiritualities. The school systems around the planet don't really do justice to the complexity of the human spiritual search over the millennia, starting in prehistoric times, shamanism, right on down through the different kind of revealed religions, up to the most recent philosophical and scientific traditions. I think that's all the birthright of every child on this planet. But then we need a kind of a meta framework, a pluralistic model, whereby rather than saying, well, I belong in this box, I'm a this, I'm a that, and you're that, so I'm going to kill you. It's like, well, I'm a human being. These are all my relatives. And what's the framework for how we can coexist on the planet as a complex, global sort of conscious being? I mean, Teilhard de Chardin talked about the noetic age, when the evolution of mind reaches a critical mass, that we can sort of move forward to what he called the omega moment, when love replaces fear and hatred as the modality of our relationships. That's kind of what this is a tool for. Okay, that's the first project, and there's a lot of stuff that I've written about that you can find out about. From that, it follows that we have to somehow create a hermeneutic of sacred texts, because a lot of the kind of different religious factions, terrorist groups, whatever, are reading their Qurans, their Bibles, their holy books in a particularly violent form. And as a scholar of peace research, working in religious studies, I've embarked on a very ambitious program, which is a commentary, line by line, on the Quran in great detail, using the Arabic, and situating it in its historical context. So this is kind of what Oliver Ramsbottom was talking about. From Gadamer, we need a kind of hermeneutic to explain how we can bring these traditions into dialogue. As a scholar of Islam, I've gone very, very deeply into the source text of the Quran. And what I've done is I've commented on it chronologically. The Quran is not published in a chronological sequence. It was written down a couple of generations after Muhammad died for particular purposes by a particular committee set up by one of the later caliphs. So we need to deconstruct that whole thing and actually put the Quran back into its chronological sequence and then really reclaim what it meant and what Muhammad intended it to mean. And then interpret that in a psychological framework. So I'm trying to explore what was going on in Muhammad's consciousness when he received this or that revelation, what was going on in his life, what's the context. It's a very ambitious project, and really I need a team of about 100 scholars helping me who are fluent in all the different languages of the Middle East and working on this together as a celebration of that lineage and that tradition. Also, there are variant readings in the Shia tradition, in the Ismaili, in the Druze, in the different Gnostic traditions within Islam, and within the different forms of the Sunni tradition, which are themselves, there's a complex, rich tradition within the Sunni tradition. So I think, let scholars from all these traditions work on this together and rediscover the Quran as a peace text. And, one of the things I'll keep returning to is the need to develop expertise in peace scholarship within the Islamic community. And I once called for the creation of a Peace Research Institute in Medina, which could be a centre of this kind of study. I still think it's a very good idea. Failing Medina, let's go for Istanbul. Simultaneously, I've been working on a commentary in a similar way on the Christian scriptures, the New Testament, which I also think need reclaiming from the kind of literalist oversimplification of the fundamentalist Christian who reads it as a text for doomsday and a kind of fatalism. God's going to save the world, Christ's coming back, meanwhile, there's nothing we can do, let's just bomb everybody, or whatever, But also the poor Christians in the Middle East who are currently being attacked and persecuted and beaten up. The Christian scriptures are themselves an extraordinary resource for peacemaking and for providing a kind of philosophical framework to cope with conflict. So I've been doing a commentary on that. And also on the Hebrew scriptures, using Hebrew and my knowledge of the Kabbalah, which is the mystical traditions within the Hebrew tradition. Again, they're a tremendous resource for peacemaking and peace wisdom, and my hope is that, Jews, Muslims and Christians should be studying each other's scriptures and realizing they're not antithetical, opposing traditions. They're like different conversations in different parts of the same forest. And, we need to move to a world which is mature enough to accommodate all those conversations in peace. I've been involved in a series of projects to do with Cordoba, based on the ancient Andalusian culture, where Islamic, Jewish and Christian scholarship worked at the highest level, which inspired Abelard in his work as a scholar, founding the University of Paris. That what they were asking was, what does cosmic intellect want? And how does that manifest through these different revelations? I think those are the questions we should be asking as peace scholars if we're going to get peace on the planet. Okay, the second research project that's ongoing, and I invite people to get involved, is in 2008 I set up in Israel and Palestine the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, known as the TRCME. There's a website and there's an ongoing conversation. And this was, even before the escalation of the current crisis in Syria and so on. I felt, and I still feel, that as someone from Britain, our country's played a complex and troubled role in creating the destabilisation that's there, going right back to World War I. There is an argument the Ottoman Empire should have stayed out of the war, and it was managing the Middle East in a reasonably stable way, and that a lot of the problems have come, out of the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. I think that British peace researchers and conflict researchers and others should collaborate on trying to work out a healing through the telling of the stories of this troubled region. I've been to Bethlehem and around Palestine interviewing people. A lot of this work is on film, because it's very difficult to get people from Israel and Palestine to meet in the same conference venue, like we've been having here. It's a luxury. You can't do that, sadly, as I discovered. So you have to go to them. So I went to the Conflict Resolution Centre in Bethlehem. I spoke to Armenian Palestinians, Arab, Islamic, Christian Palestinians, and heard their separate narratives and stories. and similarly with different people from the Jewish community, and also from Egypt and Lebanon and now Turkey, and indirectly Iran and Iraq. It's work that's only still at the beginning stage, and the research that's needed is to look at all the existing truth and reconciliation commissions that exist on the planet. There've been quite a few. South Africa was the founding model. In Istanbul, I just met the woman who was the secretary to Desmond Tutu during the whole South African TRC process, and was learning about the protocols, how they went ahead and did all this. Other countries have got these things going. So the research that's needed is to compare and contrast them all, and then see what model is needed for the Middle East. The other question is, should national governments be involved, or should this be an NGO-led thing? Well, I'm open to discussion on that and open to research. I think at the moment it's an NGO-led thing. My view is if governments want to get involved, then they're welcome, but it has to be on our terms. Because obviously if governments start dictating what's permissible to be said, then you have a problem. Okay, so there's more about that I could say in question and discussion maybe afterwards. The third thing I want to share is an ongoing research project, which is the idea for creating a European Union mediation service. Now, this happened again in 2008, when I was travelling back through the Balkans to Venice from Athens. And it was the time when the first glimmers of conflict were hovering in Ukraine, when there was problems with the gas pipeline. I don't know if you remember back to 2008. And Russia briefly shut down the gas pipeline servicing Ukraine, which in turn sort of stopped some of the stuff getting into Eastern Europe. And I had this horrible premonition that, my God, there's going to be conflict and trouble in Ukraine soon on those issues. And I thought, well, I was in Venice going around the Doge's palace. I don't know if you've been to Venice, any of you. Venice used to rule the kind of Mediterranean, and in this enormous palace, there are maps from the whole world, as it was known in Venice, all the way from Newfoundland in Canada to the Caspian Sea. And they're big. Each map is the size of that wall. And there's like 30 maps in great detail. They're works of art. And I was thinking, my God, if even one city, Venice, could use that knowledge and experience, why can't we in modern Europe somehow help mediate conflicts on the borders of Europe? It's not in our geopolitical interests as the European Union to see enormous conflict break out in Ukraine or Mediterranean bordering countries. So I wrote to the then President of the European Union and said, what would it take institutionally to get embedded in the European Constitution an official European Union mediation service, staffed by bureaucrats, but experts and trained mediators, recruited from each European country, Finland, Austria, whatever, but non-political. So these are experts, right, who would immediately, by statute, be invited in when trouble broke out in a neighbouring country. So the research that's needed is to, we need people like you've done going undercover into the arms fair. We need people going in undercover into the European Union mechanisms and tweaking the right levers to create such a thing. Now, I've had some success, and in conversations with they then appointed this foreign minister for Europe, Baroness Ashton, who actually had very little experience and knowledge of European affairs. They've just appointed the Italian foreign secretary, who again has very little knowledge of foreign affairs, and yet who will be like a figurehead trying to do mediations around. What I'm saying is that we need a genuine mediatory pool of experts to go in when there are conflicts. And, that's some ongoing research that we could do, and which could have a very, very practical outcome immediately. It's already ongoing, that. Okay, the next thing I want to share is, this is to do with Britain and Ireland. And a number of people from Ireland have been at this conference. I'm quarter Irish myself, and where I live in Argyll was the Irish part of Scotland. And I think the troubles in Ireland between the British and the Irish are quite interesting as a model for how conflict can hopefully be reconciled. We heard yesterday from Fergal, I think he's called, about how there's peace but it's not real peace. And you probably heard me ask the question about whether a Truth and Reconciliation Commission would help. Well, I thought it would, so I, my institute went and set one up. We've had meetings in Holyhead, in Dublin, in Belfast, and we've heard from IRA, ex-IRA people, Protestant people, and trying to build up a picture. My strategy has been to do it quite low key, but I think that getting the peace research community involved from Ireland would be advantageous. And I don't know why, I think in this case the British and Irish governments could, co-sponsor a series of meetings, actually, and then make available some sort of compensation. There should be some monetary gain for giving testimony, I suspect. One of the problems would be with confidentiality, and recently there was a whole thing about some tapes were made by I think Jerry Adams or somebody connected to him, which were then stored in a locked vault in a Canadian or American university, that were then released contrary to the agreement. And that's caused huge kerfuffle because it looks like, one of them ordered killings and stuff. So there are going to be huge problems about. And the research question is whether it's better for peace to kind of maybe not explore certain areas, whether silence is sometimes better, or is it better to go into the real grounding of the facts and the details. And in IPRA, there's one of the commissions deals with reconciliation and transitional justice, and there was some discussion and research about that. But I think there's more needed, and I think we should then look at that from the UK and Irish perspective. Another project, a research project, is to do with what I call the Golden Gate Project. Now, this comes out of my work as a peace scholar and a philosopher, and it's what you could call using the comparative eschatology of the different religions of the Middle East in a positive way. Okay, there's a legend. I don't know if you've been to Jerusalem, but there's a wall around the old city of Jerusalem, and there's a gate on the eastern edge of the old city of Jerusalem, which is locked, and has been since the Ottoman sultans shut it in the 1560s. The legend is that gate will only be opened at the end of time, at the Last Judgment, when the Messiah comes, after which there will be peace on the world. Until then, we're going to have wars, chaos, maelstrom. I sat outside that gate and had a deep think about this. And because I've worked a lot with interfaith leadership, I could see the gate opening and the world's interfaith leaders, senior Muslims, Jews, Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, whatever, Hopi Indians, going together through the gate. Right, and actually sort of realizing that eschatological promise. So, rather than waiting for the Messiah to come and open the gate, and then we can have peace, what I'm saying is let's collectively realize that messianic moment and open the gate collectively with all the different religious and spiritual leaders of the planet, holding that space together. And what a tremendous signal and sign it would send to the planet that, yes, peace is possible, we can do this. So that's the idea, and I've talked to religious leaders throughout the Middle East and elsewhere, and the obstacles of getting that to happen involve. I've talked to people in the Israeli tourist industry who say it's a great idea, that would boost tourism. The Palestinians say that's a great idea. Of course, we would own that gate, and that's in East Jerusalem, so that will be in our capital. Fine. The details remain to be worked out, and it's an ongoing research project. Okay, so the next thing I want to share is, after years of thinking about conflict research and peace research, I've come to hold the view there's a missing link in what we're doing. And so, and what I've given a name to that, and that's what I call peace policy research. in the international relations community, conflict research community, political science era, we have international relations research, we have international policy studies, we have security policy, we have surveillance policy studies, kind of stuff that Steve's been talking about. We have defence policy and we have foreign policy. We have think tanks all over the planet dealing with all these aspects of policy. We have nowhere dealing with peace policy. And this is why I think we've created such a chaos in military interventions in Libya and Iraq, and why people don't know what to do about Syria. What I'm saying is we need to urgently pay attention to thinking through certain basic parameters for peace policy. So in the castle I've set up a Centre for Peace Policy Research, which is unique on the planet. Nobody else is thinking, what would peace actually look like in country X or Y? I've been in discussions with the British Foreign Office to go to them and talk to them and articulate and say, look, rather than thinking about, my view is that Britain's strategic interests are best suited by developing and articulating a coherent, rational and effective peace policy. So that when a country blows up in, civil war situation, we have a solution to put forward. And I think that's true for Russia and for the States and for the European Union. So this is an ongoing project. We need to articulate and research what a peace policy will look like for our countries. Because if we go on not having one, surprise, surprise, we'll go on having enormous conflicts and all the costs involved in that. So, for example, in the Gaza-Hamas issue, the Centre for Peace Policy Research issued a 19-point plan based on, a peace policy proposal, and it's on the web, you can look at it. And the same with research needed into the Ukraine situation. Again, if we had a peace policy in Britain and Europe, we would offer mediation immediately. We wouldn't have, as it were, taken sides. What happened was the European Union sort of got sucked into, because of the ineptitude of Baroness Ashton, because she's not a trained mediator, doesn't know what she's doing. She was used by one faction in the Ukrainian civil war to be the kind of token of Western Europeanism that they want to buy into, rather than genuinely saying, we are neutral, and it is in our interests that you should live in peace, and then bringing all the sides of Ukraine together to talk to each other. And having an effective peace policy articulated would then be in our interest, because Ukraine would not be falling apart and causing this risk of huge troubles if that conflict isn't resolved. Another research project and proposal I'd like to bring to your attention, therefore, is that the Foreign Office and its officials, and its equivalents in other countries, not just in Britain, this is, bigger picture, should be trained in the concepts of having a peace policy in place. At the moment, they're working very low down the level of responses to conflict. So, for instance, when I spoke to the head of the Syria policy a couple of years ago, trying to suggest we have a multi-faith mediation approach, basically I was told, no, we can't do that because we've taken sides. We, the Foreign Office, and me personally as head of the Syrian policy, are supporting the armed Sunni rebels who are trying to topple Assad, and that's what we're doing. Well, are you kidding? Because that's now created ISIS and all their ilk. So there's no joined-up thinking, and what I'm suggesting is these people need retraining. Next research proposal, and I'm coming to the end now, only got 3 to go, is when I was employed at the University of London to create a national centre for peace research, and there's one in the States, the National Institute of Peace Research there. Their system is that 1%, I think it is, of the Pentagon's budget, or actually it's 0.1% of the Pentagon's war budget, goes automatically to the Washington Institute of Peace. I think we need a similar thing in the UK. And I'd like to see a peace research institute in London which would host conferences like this, weekly, and bring the brightest and best brains together in Britain and Europe. And that it should be funded with 1% of the military budget of the MOD. And now, what's blocking that? How intelligent are our politicians? We need to do some research into that. We need to lobby and work with intelligent parliamentarians to actually get that on the statute book. And I think it should be an all-party proposal. It's a liberal, a conservative, a Labour, a UKIP, whatever, I don't care. It's in the Britain's national interest to have such an institute, because it's in our interest to have peace in the world. Next thing is research is needed into the school curriculum. And don't forget, I worked as a teacher for 10 years in schools. They're the future generation. And in Britain, we have religious education on the syllabus, which I think is a good thing. But I think the curriculum needs greatly expanding, and with greater emphasis on the values and virtues embraced by each of the faiths. And hopefully our last speaker is going to talk about that kind of thing. At the moment, it tends to be too much secular bias. Look at all these quaint people and their religious customs. Aren't they weird? You know, this is what they do. This is the kind of feasts they have. Aren't they silly? That's the kind of thought world that kids get from doing religious studies. I think what it should be is look at these incredible spiritual journeys that our ancestors have taken. These are the findings they've come up with. These are the golden rules and values that these faiths inculcate, and we can learn so much from them, you know. And we can suspend judgment over which ultimately is right, but we can vaguely know that these ones are kind of right-ish, and these ones are pretty wrong-ish. So I think there is an ethical role for schools, and the curriculum needs improving. And then last but not least, this is a huge thing I've talked with some of the people at this conference about. As a scholar of Islamic philosophy and history, I know enough to know that the split and the war going on between Sunnis and Shias is an intellectual monstrosity. It shouldn't be happening. If you go back into the source of Islam, you know, what it was supposed to be as opposed to what it's become, that split is a kind of family squabble between Ali and Fatima that long ago should have been healed. And I think we should be working with Islamic scholars in all Middle Eastern countries, Islamic countries. The main Shia country is Iran. I suppose the main Sunni one would be Saudi Arabia, but intellectually Egypt. And we should be helping them host a big conference, or a series of conferences, on peace and reconciliation between the Shia and Sunni wings of Islam. Now, because a lot of the conflict in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon and elsewhere is about this conflict between Sunni and Shia. If we can head that off at the pass by getting an international focus on healing that split, if we can get the world's greatest Sunni and Shia scholars to sign a peace declaration and a declaration of non-violence, then we can say to their respective followers in all these countries, look, put the guns down, guys, we've made peace. But I think it has to be done with, firstly, sort of not exactly in covert, but kind of secret diplomacy a bit, and then brought into the open when we've got some way down the line, and then made a lot of, you know, with great public declarations. And I think that would be really advancing peace. Now you could say, well, why is that in the interests of Israel or the West? Surely we like the fact that all these Islamic countries are having civil wars. Look, they're all destabilised and killing each other. I don't agree with that at all. I think that's outrageous. And I think, like I say, it's in our interest to have a peace policy, to do genuine peace promotion and creation and research that leads to that. And this Sunni Shia peace conference would be an amazing gift, in that direction. Okay, those are some ongoing projects that I'm involved with, and I welcome any, participation, support, and comments and feedback. Thank you so much.